I've been asked to give a brief history of the racial wealth gap in federal policy, the need for grassroots advocacy, and Ford's vision of how coalitions with the support of institutions like Howard can help meet that need. When many of us gathered in New York a couple of weeks ago, I said that the racial wealth gap is at the core of asset poverty. So what is the racial wealth gap? It is the difference in wealth, or assets minus debts, between white people and people of color. A report by the Insight Center for Community Economic Development cites data from the Federal Reserve's 2007 Survey of Consumer Finances and states that for every dollar owned by the median white family in the United States, the typical Latino family has 12 cents, and the typical African American family has a dime. As stark as these figures are, the economic status of women of color is far worse. A study released by Insight in March of 2010 showed that single African American women have a median wealth of $100. For Latinas, it's $120. Now this compares to a little less than $8,000 for African American men, a little less than $10,000 for Latinos, about $41,500 for white women, and almost $44,000 for white men. Okay, can you hear me now? These studies show the racial wealth gap at a single point in time, but it's also important to examine what happens to this gap over the years. Thomas Shapiro, who co-authored Black Wealth, White Wealth with Melvin Oliver, recently released a study that measured the change in the racial wealth gap from 1984 to 2007, about a generation. He found that the racial wealth gap has quadrupled from a difference of about 20,000 in 1984 to a gap of 95,000 in 2007. While the median financial assets for white families grew dramatically, it remained flat for African Americans. Among the highest income earning households, white households held nearly 250,000 in wealth, while African Americans held only 18,000. Now, some news reporters who wrote about these studies concluded that the racial wealth gap is due to frivolous spending, poor life choices, and the use of check cashers and the like. Even Chairman Ben Bernanke of the Federal Reserve, in a speech to students at Morehouse College, a historically black college, as you know, attributed the racial wealth gap to the lack of financial education. Such analyses that focus on the individual rather than on institutions are simplistic and wrong-headed. As books such as Black Wealth, White Wealth, and The Color of Wealth have documented, the racial wealth gap has its roots in public policies that have facilitated the acquisition of assets by white families while simultaneously preventing or inhibiting asset accumulation by families of color. Policies such as the Homestead Act of 1862 and legislation that created the Home Loan Corporation of 1933 created historic barriers to asset accumulation for communities of color. While the laws have changed, these practices continue. So if we fast forward to the Great Recession, a 2009 study was produced by the National Council of Negro Women in partnership with the National Community Reinvestment Act, and you'll hear from Jim Carr in a minute, and they found that African American women and Latinas were twice as likely to receive high-cost subprime loans as white women, and this was true for middle and upper income women as well as low-income women. So what can be done to close the racial wealth gap? Ford's approach has been to focus on the racial wealth gap as part of its broader work on asset poverty. In doing so, we've partnered with Howard University's Economics Department to create the Center on Race and Wealth. And the center fosters research on the racial wealth gap and builds the pipeline of new scholars with expertise on issues of asset poverty faced by people of color. But research alone will not end disparities in asset wealth. Research must be coupled with action that changes policy. So the Center on Race and Wealth has also provided training to its students and to community organizations on moving from research findings to policy changes. This work has been consistent with Ford's larger body of work on saving and asset building. And as you've heard me say a number of times, many of you, Ford's approach in the past has been to support national research and that could inform members of Congress about the need for saving and asset building policies. A review of this work in 2008 and the strategic planning process that we went through when our new president came on board led to the identification of the need to work not only at the national level, but also to build constituencies from the ground up, and to do so through state and regional coalitions. Members of Congress needed to hear from people within their own districts that saving and asset building is necessary for their economic mobility. And members of Congress also needed to see models of saving and asset building policy at the state level that could then be transformed into national policy. So we've maintained our support for policy work at the national level, but we've made a huge investment in state and regional coalition building as well. And as we've made this investment, we have also maintained our focus on the racial wealth gap and the need to address this at the state and regional level in addition to the national level. We've not assumed that all of the coalitions would have the resources needed to take on this issue and have provided support for resource organizations of various kinds to provide expertise and assistance with in helping coalitions to engage with communities of color on the issue of the racial wealth gap. And Howard University was well placed to be one of these resource organizations. In addition to Howard, we are also supporting Realize Consulting Group, Insight Center for Community and Economic Development, UCLA's Asian American Studies Center, the National Council of La Raza, the Center for Family Policy and Practice, the National Council of Negro Women, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and Policy Link. Howard has put together a great meeting that includes representatives from several of these resource organizations, and I'm really pleased to be here.